It began with an obscure note discovered in a disorganized university archive, an old unfinished manuscript, its ink faded and margins annotated by shaky hands. The document mentioned a remote village and a certain estate hidden beyond fields of withered grass and untended orchard trees. It claimed that beneath thick layers of neglect and legend, the estate, Holloway House, stored within its walls a story unwritten by any historian yet. Eleanor, a researcher known for her meticulous approach and willingness to venture into remote corners of the world, found herself drawn to these cryptic references. She had followed such trails before, but never one so shrouded in vague warnings and half-whispered rumors. The journey to the village was not straightforward. She traveled for days through regions absent from most maps, fields turned brown by the season's end, and woodlands dense enough to devour all but the narrowest footpaths. Finally, she crossed a creaking wooden bridge and arrived at a cluster of cottages leaning inward, as if to keep secrets among themselves. The villagers spoke sparingly, offering neither welcome nor hostility, merely a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. When she asked about Holloway House, many diverted their gaze, some shrugging as though uncertain it still stood, others hinting at a place best left alone. Only the oldest among them, an elder seated by a window thick with dust, pointed down a lane that vanished into a dark thicket. No one tried to stop her, but no one encouraged her either. Beyond that thicket, the mansion emerged into view. Holloway House slouched at the end of a long, overgrown avenue of yews and oak trees, their branches entwined overhead. At first glance, the estate resembled a grand relic from centuries past. Its roof line formed jagged silhouettes against a darkening sky, and what remained of its balconies and archways bore evidence of meticulous craftsmanship. Yet everything had been left to the mercy of time and weather. Moss-covered stone steps, iron gates had rusted to a dull red, and ivy had claimed entire sections of the facade. A sense of suspended history clung to the structure, as if it had been sealed off from the changing world. Upon entering, Eleanor found the interior subdued and still. A long entry hall stretched before her, its parquet floor warped by years of damp. Dust motes drifted in the lantern light, and the silence suggested she was not simply alone, but intruding where the air itself had forgotten the sound of footsteps. The doors she passed were tall, carved of heavy wood, and within each room she glimpsed the outlines of old furniture, draped in white sheets. The decay had touched everything here, peeling wallpaper, torn curtains, and tarnished metalwork hinted at a past era of grandeur. More curious still were the mirrors. They hung in nearly every corridor and chamber. Tall, narrow mirrors with gilded frames, squat oval ones with intricate carvings, and some that stretched nearly to the ceiling. All of them were coated in dust and grime, their reflective surfaces dulled to a vague murkiness. What had originally drawn Eleanor here was the rumor that Holloway House's last inhabitants vanished without explanation. Some believed they left by night, escaping creditors or scandal. Others whispered that they never left the grounds at all, slipping instead into some secret place within the mansion. The historian in her demanded clarity, and as she ventured deeper, her notes filled with small observations. A broken statue near a fireplace, a trunk emptied of its documents, footprints left by some previous explorer who did not stay long. She noticed that the mirrors were always placed in positions that seemed more deliberate than decorative, as if meant to capture and hold certain angles of the room. In the main hall, she wiped clean the surface of a particularly splendid mirror. Beneath the grime, a distorted version of the room emerged, but something was off. She could see herself standing there, lantern in hand, but behind her the furniture in the reflection did not match the reality she had just observed. A table appeared in the glass that did not exist when she turned around. A chair in the actual hall seemed absent in the reflection. It might have been a trick of old glass. She resolved to be methodical, leaving small markers in rooms and then comparing them carefully in each mirror she cleaned. Yet the discrepancies continued. Upstairs, she found a parlor where several mirrors had been covered by heavy velvet drapes. Uncovering one, she saw herself again, only this time, her reflected attire appeared several centuries older, as if she wore a stiff collar and long skirt in place of her modern clothing. In another chamber, a mirror revealed fleeting silhouettes passing behind her. She spun around, lantern raised, but the corridor was empty, with no sign of movement. The silence, broken only by the soft creak of old floors, made it difficult to tell whether her senses were playing tricks or if something within these mirrors observed her, waiting. Determined to uncover an explanation, Eleanor probed deeper into the mansion's secrets. A door behind the dining hall led to a neglected library. Towers of leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked by age, lined tall shelves. The room smelled of old paper and damp wood. She found loose sheets of parchment in drawers, letters written in a bold hand discussing the acquisition of rare objects. Deeper in a back alcove behind a cabinet that had tipped halfway over, she discovered a slim journal with a marbled cover and a name inked on the first page. Alistair Holloway. Alistair's entries began cordially enough, noting the mansion's additions over time, the assortment of mirrors collected from distant lands. He wrote of travels to old markets, auctions in dimly lit halls, and negotiations with collectors of peculiar antiquities. Gradually, his tone changed. He began describing how, one evening, he noticed differences in the reflections. At first it was subtle, furniture slightly rearranged, a door that appeared open in the mirror but not in reality. With each passing day, the phenomena became more pronounced. Alistair recorded that the mirrors no longer behaved as inert objects. They seemed to hold worlds within them, alternate versions of Holloway House, each with its own qualities and histories. He confessed that he had glimpsed people in these reflections, familiar figures now twisted by strange fashions or grim expressions, and at times strangers who bore unsettling resemblances to his family. The final pages spoke of the mirrors as portals, not simply windows. They invited things to pass through, entities that watched with keen interest. "They are waiting for me to lower my guard," read one entry. "I am convinced that these reflections wish to supplant what stands before them. They adapt, they learn, and they do not forget our presence." Alistair warned any future reader to beware, to avoid lingering too long before any mirror, lest something within might reach across the threshold. His last words were a plea. "If you find these pages, leave this place. Do not meet your own gaze in these mirrors once you suspect they have awakened. Eleanor shut the journal with care. She should leave. Her research had uncovered enough to craft a cautionary tale for the scholarly community. Yet her historian's mind demanded verification. Steeling herself, she attempted to retrace her steps, taking the lantern and her notes and heading for the exit. But Holloway House had changed. Corridors looped back into themselves. Doors that were once open refused to budge, and new hallways seemed to emerge where none should have existed. She tried to mark her path with chalk on the walls, but the next time she passed those same spots, the chalk marks were gone. At each turn, she encountered another mirror, and each time, her reflection was not a passive image, but a figure standing with a distinct posture, its eyes fixed on hers. She realized the reflections were becoming bolder. Their gazes conveyed not mere interest, but intent. One mirror showed her holding not a lantern, but a tall candle, dripping with wax. Another displayed the entry hall filled with fresh flowers and newly polished floors, as though it reflected Holloway House at the height of its splendor. Yet in that perfect reflection, she noticed her image wore a strange smirk and stood in a position that did not match her own stance. At last she found herself back in the main hall. Now uncovered and shining, the multitude of mirrors faced her. In their depths, she saw many Eleanors. Some seemed weary, others defiant, a few strangely amused. She attempted to break one of the mirrors by striking it with a heavy candlestick. The blow rang dully, but the glass did not shatter. Instead, the reflected versions of herself flinched as if startled, then recovered, watching more closely. The silence in the hall extended like a drawn curtain, and she felt the sense that time itself had slowed. Without warning, one reflection took a half step forward inside its frame, a movement not mirrored by Eleanor herself. She tried to move away, but as she did, the reflected figure moved differently. It began mouthing words. Although no sound emerged from behind the glass, Eleanor understood the meaning. We have studied you. You sought us out. Now remain. Another mirror showed a version of Eleanor standing amid a crowd of figures, each one a subtle variant of her face, as if she had been multiplied across countless worlds. Yet another depicted the mansion's rooms as they might appear decades from now, with ivy thick enough to break through windows. In all these scenes, reflections of her hovered, waiting, poised, like actors on a stage before their grand entrance. Suddenly, the mirror directly before her, the one she had first wiped clean, flickered. The figure inside it leaned forward and lifted its hand, pressing it against the inner surface. Eleanor tried to step back, but her feet would not move as expected. The reflective world and the real world seemed to merge at the edges, the barrier thinning. Before she could shout or drop her lantern, the figure slipped outward. It was as though the glass turned momentarily liquid, allowing this other Eleanor to emerge, stepping into the hall with a calm assurance. For a moment, both stood face to face. The newcomer carried the poise of someone who had observed for a long time and understood exactly what to do. With a slow turn, the double turned her back on the trapped historian, heading toward the great doors. Eleanor tried to follow, but an unseen boundary prevented her. She was now on the opposite side of the glass, her reality reversed. She stared at her own hands and touched the mirror's interior surface, which felt cool and unyielding. She could see the hall, the dust, the scattered furniture, but now from inside a reflection. The doppelganger paused at the threshold and glanced over her shoulder. The look in those eyes held no malice, only a distant satisfaction. Then she stepped out of Eleanor's view, leaving the original historian trapped in a silent, mirrored world. Eleanor tried to call out, to demand release, but no sound reached beyond her prison. She was left within the reflections, joining those who had vanished before her, a silent observer of countless possibilities, forever separated from the world she once knew.